hope you've been having a great conference so far. In this session, Ramiro and I are going to invite you to rethink how you've been developing all this time. I am Arsh, and I work as a developer experience engineer at Okteto.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our talk, and my name is Ramiro. I am one of the founders of Okteto, a colleague of Arsh.
Let's get started then. So there has been a tremendous change in the way we deploy applications over the last 5 to 10 years. Thanks to containers and the cloud, we now have much more efficient ways of shipping applications. This change allowed us not only to ship frequently and effectively, but also to ship much more complex applications than the ones we were shipping before. So these days, a modern cloud native application could easily consist of 20 or more microservices. And in this talk, we are going to talk about how this change affected development. In the good old simple days, you would just bring up your entire application on your local dev machine and then code out your changes. Then as we started coding more and more complex monolithic applications, the bringing your application up phase started taking a lot of time. So what did we do? Gradually, we started breaking down these monoliths into multiple microservices. Now, this change did make it a little bit easier to develop locally, since instead of bringing up the entire application, you would just bring up the microservices you required. But do note that even with this approach, if you needed to bring up all the microservices together, then it was a demanding task for the local machine. Soon, this world of microservices combined with the world of containers, and that, well, let's just say, made things even more complicated for developers. It was no longer 2-3 simple microservices. The number of microservices making up an application rose up significantly. Even the interactions between these microservices started to become complex. So if you wanted to develop on a particular microservice, which depended on a couple of other microservices, not only would your machine take up a lot of time to bring them up, but you yourself as the developer would have to do a lot of configuration to make sure your dev environment is all set. And I can tell you from a personal experience that doing this daily is not fun at all. Another thing which changed was the fact that the way we were running these microservices in development started to differ a lot from how we ran them in production. So while developing, majority of developers would just run them on their local machine, right? But in production, not only were these microservices running in containers, but the containers themselves were running on cloud more often than not in Kubernetes clusters. So you see how things changed so much to the point where the local dev environment was just not enough for this new world of cloud native applications. So what did we do? It's not like we did not do anything to keep up with this change. A lot of developers and organizations did realize the severity of these problems we talked about. They understood that things needed to be changed because the traditional ways of development were a thing of the past. But in this talk, we ask you to rethink the solutions we resorted to because we feel none of them completely solved the problems we discussed. To fix the long times in bringing up microservices locally, we started using cloud resources by SSHing into remote machines and using them to run these microservices. Now, you could say this solves the problem of inadequate resources on local machines, but it is pretty inconvenient and leads to an overall bad developer experience. Not only to forget that it suffers from the same problem of a lack of general feedback, which local environments suffered from. That is to say, the dev environment is way different from how things would run in production. What this does is it leads to some really nasty bugs, which get spotted very late in the dev cycle. And believe me, you do not want those. So to avoid getting these bugs and give developers access to production-like environments during dev, we came up with other solutions, namely staging or QA environments and CI/CD pipelines. Now, there is no denying that they do a very good job of ensuring that the final application which gets shipped is up to the mark. But the problem with them, again, is that they don't lead to a good developer experience during the development phase. Emphasis on during. And by during development, I'm referring to the code writing phase. The problem with these methods is that they happen very late in the dev cycle. After you've written your code, you write it, commit it, push it, and then CI pipelines and staging environments come into the picture. And even then, they take a lot of time, thus delaying how soon you're able to get genuine feedback for the code you've written. Don't get me wrong here. I want to reiterate that all these approaches are indeed useful and they have their important role to play. But what I'm saying is that they solve a different kind of problem than the one we have been talking about. And at this point, I know you are eager to hear the solution, so let's just get to it. As the title screams in bright orange, the solution is remote dev environments. But these words get used a lot in different contexts, so let's go over what we are referring to. Without much explanation, I think the word remote makes it clear that we are no longer depending on the local dev machine's resources. And instead, we would leverage cloud resources to run all the microservices we require. But instead of SSHing into a remote machine and using its resources for that, we instead leverage remote clusters running in the cloud. So the microservices you need to bring up during development will get deployed to the cloud exactly how they get deployed in production. I think you can now start to see how this approach would solve the limitation of genuine feedback we discussed earlier. Deploying these microservices to cloud infra ensures that what we see in development is exactly what we'll get in production. Not like, but exactly. So this solves two of the problems we discussed earlier. First, we use cloud resources, so the whole thing is not only faster, but no longer limited by the resources of a particular dev machine. And secondly, we bring up the microservices required in development in the same fashion as we would in production. So we can be sure that our dev environment is mirroring prod, and thus we get genuine feedback. But some questions still remain unanswered. If the microservices we are developing on have already been deployed in a remote cluster, then how exactly do we develop them? And more importantly, how is the developer experience like when developing in these remote dev environments? Will we have to learn new tools, change the way we have been writing code? To answer all these questions, let's take an example and understand how these remote dev environments work. For the sake of simplicity, we'll only talk about two microservices in this example, but the logic extends to all the complex applications you've been writing. Going to the next slide, let's say you're a backend engineer working on a movie streaming application. You've been tasked with adding a feature to the API. While coding out your change, you also want to see how the front-end microservices would get affected by the changes you make. So like we discussed in the previous slide, you deploy both of these microservices to a cluster running on the cloud. Now, this solves the problem of the long wait times in bringing these services up and ensures that you see them how they would look like in production. But again, how do you develop them? So to this problem, we have the solution of Okteto CLI, which we'll use to create our remote dev environments. Okteto CLI replaces the container running in the cluster with a development container, which inherits all its configuration from the original container. Since the configuration is inherited from the original container, everything continues to function exactly as it was before. So if we want to develop the API microservice, Okteto CLI will replace the API container with a dev API container, as you can see in this figure. Now, what's so special about this dev container? Okteto CLI sets up a file synchronization service, which will sync the code you write on your local machine with that running inside the dev container. Are things starting to make more sense? Any code change you make will get transferred to this dev container running in the cluster on the cloud. So as soon as you hit save, and I promise, as soon as you hit save, after making a change, you will be able to view it exactly like it would look in the deployed version of your application. We'll soon see this in action, but for a minute, let's get back to our previous slide. So what this means from a developer experience perspective is that once you have your remote dev environment set up, you can continue coding just like you did before in those good old days, using the same tools you love and are familiar with. all the magic happens behind the scenes automatically for you. As soon as you save your code changes, immediately you view them exactly how they would look like in production. Instant and genuine feedback is what these remote dev environments enable. Enough talking now. Let me hand over to Ramiro to show you these remote dev environments in action.
Thanks, Arsh. This was a great explanation of remote dev environments. And just to summarize, because we're all here at DevExConf, we all care about dev experience. The idea with remote dev environments is to bring a better dev experience to all developers building modern applications. Multiple microservices, not having to run them on your local machine makes you more efficient. Having a realistic environment where the feedback that you get is the same feedback you're going to get on staging or even on production, they just make our lives easier. We can then worry less about, will my work work? How do I have to deploy this thing locally? And then we can think more in terms of, what am I building for my customers? What value am I shipping today? And that is truly our objective, is help kind of like shift the way we develop to this new world of remote dev environments and make everybody more efficient, happier, and at the end of the day, make our customers happier by the things we're building. So I'm going to give you a demo of the dev experience that Arsh was showing. I'm going to use the Okteto CLI, which, by the way, is open source, works with any Kubernetes cluster. You can just go to github.com/Okteto to get it. And I'm also going to use Okteto Cloud, which is our free cloud service. I'm going to use them to show you how this dev experience looks like. But please focus on the how, the why, but not the how. Like, if you're using anything else, all these concepts are valid. What I want you to get once you leave this talk is why dev environments need to be remote, need to be replicable, and they need to look like production. So let's go at it. For the demo, I'm going to take the application that Arsh showed on the slides, this movie streaming application. This movie has three components: the API, the front end, and a database to store our movies. And it's built using containers and deployed via a Helm chart. So, a very standard cloud native application. So I'm going to go to VS Code and show you how it works. The code is here, right? I have my API, some repo, my chart, front end, everything is there. So one of the first things you need as you move to remote dev environments is really give developers, this one command to get started. In the case of the Okteto CLI, is Okteto up. After Okteto up, then you tell Okteto which service I'm going to be working on. In this case, the API. I press enter. What's happened now is what Arsh described. Okteto will deploy this application on your remote Kubernetes cluster. It will create a volume for your code. It will start this file synchronization service. It will build whatever images it needs. It's all these things that you will normally do by hand, but now they're happening automatically, and they're happening directly on your remote cluster. If you look at my menu bar here, you'll see I'm not running Docker, because now everything is running remote. Once Okteto up finishes that initial sequence, I'm on this terminal. What this means? Well, if I do who I am, you'll see this is root. What's happening here is that now I am on this dev container running Kubernetes that happens to run Linux. So now that I have my remote container, I can just work using the same tools I've used before. In this case, this application uses Express and Node.js. So yarn start will start my server. I have to install my dependencies. And now start. And there we go. In this case, yarn start will use Node mon and my configuration defining package.json. So pretty standard Node application. So everything is running. So I'm going to take a slight detour, go back to my browser, and show you how this looks like from the UI. This is the Okteto Cloud UI. Important things that we want you to see with this UI. And if you build your own, keep this in mind as things you should give your developers. First is easy access to the application. In this case, Okteto creates automatically all the infra you need for your application: ingress, containers, database, all of it. Just click on this link, and you see my application is now up and running. This application is just for me. It has a URL that is only for me. That way, I can iterate on my own version of the application without blocking it, let's say Arsh, from building his own feature. The other thing that you want to give your developers is an easy way to access the status of things. In this case, we are showing the logs here. This is the log for the front end, which right now is just the load balancer. We have the log for MongoDB. And you get is the whole idea here is give developers all the information without having them to think about how to run it, how to start, all those things. With this Okteto up, I deployed my entire application and I'm ready to work. So now let's go back to VS Code because we're developers, we like to write code. And I'm gonna show you how this works. In this case, let's start with something simple, right? I'm gonna add a new log here just for fun. You see I'm using VS Code, I'm getting autocomplete, the same experience because I'm using my local tools, the tools I am familiar with. And in this case, we're gonna do hello from Okteto. As Arsh said, I'm gonna save. I'm gonna go back to this remote terminal and you'll notice that immediately Nodemon picked up the change that Okteto synchronized and reloaded my process. If I go back here and reload the movies app, it still works. But if I go back to VS Code, you see that now my code is there. So change was applied. I didn't have to review my application. I'm getting the same fast local experience, but now everything is in my remote dev environment. But that's a very trivial example. So let's take it, up a notch to something a bit more realistic. As Arsh was saying, mobile applications are complex and they have multiple pieces. In this case, we have a front end that calls an API. Arsh already built a new feature for this application. We have now a list of movies and a list of movies that we're watching. But if you notice, it's the same list. So something happened here. I know that something is odd because now I have these two services running. I can validate that the end-to-end communication is happening. Front end is calling the API, but something is not here. So let's go back to the code. Go back to server.js, and we have two APIs, movies and watching. Movies is here. It's in that log they added. It's reading the movies collection and returning the result. Fairly simple. So now let's go back to watching. Watching, I get the watching API, I'm logging. And in this case, you'll notice we have an integration issue. We're calling the movies collection, not the watching collection. And this is a very typical situation you run when you're building applications with multiple services. Communication works. Every component works well on its own, but integration is where you start to discover all these things. So the fact that I have a fully integrated environment that looks like production is helping me a lot here because I'm validating that my front end is calling the API is calling the database, and that all information is flowing. So in this case, the solution seems simple. I'm going to change from movies to watching. Again, I'm just going to save my file, go back to the terminal, Nodemon, reload it again, go back to our browser, refresh, and you'll see that now my application is working as expected. I can test this end-to-end. I don't have to build any container. I don't have to deploy to staging before seeing if my changes work. This is not going to replace your CI pipeline. This is not going to replace your CD pipeline. This is all about making your developers more efficient by moving all this to a remote cluster and giving your developers the same kind of infrastructure, security configuration, access patterns that you're going to have when you're building a staging. And it's all about that, right? It's all about making all of our lives easier, faster, and really preventing those super annoying only in production kind of bugs. And that is really, my dream with Okteto is if we can just help erase that class of bugs, we're going to be super excited. So Arsh, I think after the demo, it's on you to wrap this up.
All right. So now that we have seen this in action, let's talk about the benefits, which I feel like we've already covered and should be clear at this point. But then again, we really want to stress on the fact that the dev environment, when you use it, it's exactly like production, okay? So you are able to get to that development phase in a matter of minutes as compared to any other alternatives of taking long times to build containers or just waiting for access to the staging cluster. So you get to the code writing phase and see how your application would look within a matter of minutes. And what this does is it generally boosts the developer productivity significantly, because as a developer, when I have to wait 30 minutes to get access to the staging cluster or for my containers to wait, I am just curious, is my change okay? Do I need to iterate? What do I need to do? There's a missing feedback, which this approach solves. So this also leads to a much faster inner development loop. So that means that when you're developing, you do not really need access to any external tools from someone else. You do not need to call your manager for access to the staging cluster, or your colleagues to check them if they need the cluster. Everything is at your hands. Each developer can get access to an isolated namespace on the cluster, and then they can continue using their familiar tools. The huge advantage of these remote dev environments is that they only outsource the parts you hate to the cloud. So you don't need to change the tools and the softwares you use to write your code. You continue developing exactly like you did before. Going to the next slide before we end the talk, we really just want to stress on the fact we've been talking about repeatedly in this talk, that your local dev environment is no longer sufficient for the cloud native applications you develop these days. Not only is it like in lagging behind in terms of hardware resources, but also there is the gap between what you write on your machine and what you'll see in production that has increased significantly over the last 5 years. So we really just want to leave you with this one quote and end it here, that if everything is happening in the cloud, then why shouldn't your dev environments be there too? And this was it from our side. Thank you so much for attending. We hope you learned something useful from this session. If you have any questions about remote dev environments, Okteto CLI, or anything in general, any feedback, please feel free to reach out to us on Twitter. We'll be happy to hear from you. Thank you so much and have a great conference.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the conference and let's build the next great dev experience together. Bye.
And surprise, surprise, it's not over just yet. Despite the thank you slide, we have live here with us, Ramiro and Arsh. Ramiro, good morning. I think you're based in California. Arsh, good evening, if I'm not mistaken. Both of you got up early or stayed up late. Thanks for that.
I'm happy to be here.
Very exciting.
So let's do a little bit of Q&A, and also if you're watching this, just please post your questions. So we want to surface some of the questions that were asked before, but let's start with the latest one, which is there any way we could achieve dev experience like you just showcased in your demo in a mobile app development?
I think so. We've been focusing a lot on kind of like the backend microservices, because that's where we kind of like, that's what we do. That's where kind of like the pain we have. I think this sort of like concept of remote environments is going to go everywhere. Yeah, like you could do it for mobile applications. I think that's something that, with Okteto, as we talk to our customers, that question has come a few times. That, hey, I'm building mobile apps. How can I benefit from this? Like, I think the IDEs are still kind of heavy to run remotely, but there's definitely a lot of work in like at least offloading some of the things you need to the backend, whether it is APS you're calling or whatever you're running, you're actually compiling, let's say, your jars for Android. I think there's definitely a future where this will grow to other types of programming. I think like they were saying in the previous talk, audio, video games. There's so much more that we can start kind of moving to the cloud to take advantage of all this never-ending compute. That I think in the next few years we're going to see that. It's not there today, at least not yet, but it is definitely a top of mind for us. Is how can we create this experience for everyone and not just for like full stack developers?
Yeah. So remote development is a big topic here. The last two sessions were both on this topic, and so I think among us it's clear where we're headed. But there was a question which I think talks a little bit more broadly about developer experience, which is what are some of the largest and still unsolved hassles you personally have and you've noticed in the software development world? So this is a very broad question. You can take it into whatever direction, I guess, as you see fit. But I think it makes a lot of sense in the context of developer experience.
Yeah, Arsh, want to take this one?
Yeah, I think at least for me personally, it would be that there is no sort of like standardization in this is more of like for onboarding and in that direction. But as a developer, like when you onboard new developers, there is just like no standardization in terms of what the onboarding process looks like, and it is needlessly complicated to the point where it gets frustrating as a new developer just setting up your machine and everything. And I feel like this is a problem which like remote development environments like improve the developer experience for significantly. Like we have had like people telling us that like this has been a game changer in terms of how fast they've been like able to onboard new employees. So that's one for me. Ramiro, if you want to add something to that.
Yeah, one for me that I think is something that I haven't seen yet a lot of people tackle is the communication across large organizations. Like dev environments, remote dev environments solve the setup, onboarding, I'm up and running. But at some point, especially if you're working on a big application across multiple teams, you need to talk to someone that owns a service. And this sounds trivial, but once you work for a big company where there might be like hundreds of teams, this is something that gets kind of complex. So I've seen some people working on this space of like, how do you share who owns another service in your stack? How do you escalate an issue to another team? I think it's something that, I see this as kind of like the day 2 of dev experience, which is first solve the problem for me as a developer. How am I more efficient? How do I go fast? But then day 2 is as an organization, as a team, how do we all kind of like make each other more efficient? So that is something that it's not a hassle for us right now because Okteto is a small company. We have 30 people. So ownership is still kind of like linear. But before Okteto, I used to work at Atlassian. And Atlassian had hundreds of microservices. I think by now I have like 1,000 odd microservices. So it's really hard to figure out, hey, who do I need to call to discuss, a new API contract? So that is something that I am looking forward to see more people tackling the communication aspect of remote dev experience and not just the, how do I onboard, which is super important. And I think a lot of companies are doing a really good job there. Git was one of them. I think we're doing something interesting there. But definitely the communication and teams is what I'm really looking forward to see more people kind of attack it. And if anybody wants to talk about this, I'm going to be at KubeCon. So we'd love to chat more about this.
Nice. And maybe we can squeeze the last one in, adding on to this. So if people are watching this that are liking the idea and they want to maybe take the idea of remote development to their teams, what do they typically need to have in place? What are things that they need to kind of solve internally before they can make this step?
That's a really good question. In terms of what they need to solve, right? I think the first need you have to solve, depending on what service you're using for remote dev environments, is definitely you need to understand how your application is run. Like whether you're using Docker Compose, Helm, or your own homebrew thing, I think having a reliable way to deploy your application is step 1. Because once you do that, then everything else is easy to automate, right? Like once you have everybody on your team is able to deploy a copy of your application, that enables all these other flows. And the copy can be, a few services, the whole thing. But having these manifests that are portable and you can use, whether you're Kubernetes or local machine, doesn't really matter. As long as they're portable and anybody can run them with a single command, for me, that is like step 1. If you're using something like VMs, you can use Vagrant. If you're using Minikube, you can use Okteto or Scaffold. If you want to go full cloud, there's Gitbot, there's Okteto, there's a few more. But definitely that one-click experience, one command, get something running is fundamental to a great dev experience.
And the best part is that like in most cases you do not need like any extra manifests. It's like all the manifests you've been using in production, they just like pave the way for these environments. So
perfect. Thanks a lot, Ramiro, Arsh. And if you still stick around on YouTube, you may be able to answer 1 or 2 more questions in the comment section. Ramiro, I hope to see you soon in Valencia then.
Yeah, see you there. And thanks to everyone. It was lovely talking to all of you, and I'll stick around. This is one of my favorite conferences of the year, so looking forward to chatting with everybody else on YouTube. Bye.